Well, it isn't a nickname because it carried serious connotations in that because of this connotation with cannibalism, and
Right.
some of the textbooks continue to call them Caribs. And throughout the years, the indigenous people in St. Vincent have suffered. And what I tried to do was to get people to understand their own history. So I dealt with a lot of names and a lot of things which people would be familiar with. The people never call themselves that. So we go back to Kalinagos, and then along with the Kalinagos are the Garifuna people, because what happened is that African, particularly in St. Vincent, slaves escaped from plantations in Barbados. Okay, one of the things that stands out about St. Vincent is that, as I think a lot of us know, Christopher Columbus came to this part of the world in 1492, although when we were growing up, we were told that Christopher Columbus came to St. Vincent in 1498 on the 22nd of January, and we actually had that as a holiday, only to find out that Christopher Columbus never came to St. Vincent, and on the 22nd of January 1490, he was actually still in Spain.
Viewers and subscribers, welcome back to the channel. Today we have Dr. Adrian Fraser, prominent historian from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and he will be walking us through some of our hidden and lost history. So please like, share, and subscribe Sayersworldtv and Vincent Internet Radio.
It's now 2 minutes after 4 o'clock. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Adrian Fraser, and your host is Mr. Moulton Sayers. Dr. Fraser, good afternoon and welcome to Vincent Internet Radio. Our host of this evening is Mr. Moulton Sayers. I'll pass it straight over to Mr. Moulton Sayers.
All right. Thank you, Sip. I just want to say pleasant good afternoon to everyone who's logged on to Vincent Internet Radio, whether via Facebook or via our internet feed. Listeners in the UK especially, and others around the world, and those in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. If you're privileged like me, you have the honor of listening to our conversation right now, because we have our special guest, historian, lecturer, author, like CP said, a household name in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and throughout most of the Caribbean, Dr. Adrian Fraser. Dr. Fraser, welcome to Vincent Internet Radio. Welcome to our program, Strictly Vinci.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be here with you.
Dr. Fraser, if I have to start, like for the people, and I think that's what Sip was trying to get into, you have so many accolades behind your name, and we just don't want to miss some of them. So if you can just like let us know, like we know you're a lecturer, we know you're one of our permanent historian in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, if not to a larger extent, the Caribbean. You know, just feed us with a little background where we can take it from there. You know, the history that you cover, and also your early education as in terms of being a historian.
Okay, I was born in Barrelly, and Barrelly is one of the towns in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So for persons who don't know, it was one of the earliest towns. I also attended for 1 year a school in Gomé, which is on the other side of St. Vincent, from Barrelly. And I went there with a teacher called Alfonso Denny, who was a friend of an uncle of mine. And Denny had a reputation for getting people into secondary school with scholarships. So I spent a year with Denny, and actually that year I learned quite a lot, because Denny was an ardent fan of E.T. Joshua, who was then chief minister. And every Wednesday night when Joshua had his meetings at the market square, he would take me there. So from very early, you know, I got a sense of what was happening where politics was concerned. I got a scholarship, went into the grammar school. At the grammar school, apart from academic work, I participated in sports, particularly football and cricket. And was actually captain at one time of the St. Vincent, of the grammar school football and cricket team. After leaving school, I spent 2 years as a teacher and then went off to Canada to study in Ontario, London, Ontario, Canada. From then I came back, taught at the grammar school for a while, and had been involved in the teacher strike of 1975. Then I was invited to be to participate or to coordinate a program in Barley, where I was born. It is in an area called Glebe Hill, where when you are just entering Barley, it was an area where the lands had been owned by the church, the Anglican church, and they wanted to turn over the lands to the people who had been paying rent for quite a long time. So I spent 3 years with them, helping to organize the community, organizing women's group, farmers, and fishermen. And after 3 years, I decided to move on and then went back to Canada and did a PhD. I missed something. I should have said also that when I first came back, when I went to Canada, first of all, after I left grammar school. And when I came back there, while teaching, I also spent 2 years at the university in Barbados, where I did a master's degree. And after this Glebe project, after I terminated the contract with the Glebe project, I then went off to Canada again, to the university I'd been before, University of Western Ontario, where I took a degree in history. Well, history had been my specialty. Although I'd originally left St. Vincent to do English, I switched to history. And while I was in Canada at the University of Western Ontario, I participated quite a lot in, I played for the cricket team and the cricket team in that part of Ontario. Also was the head of the international students body. And then with some African friends, we formed the African Caribbean Forum. And one of the highlights of that forum was that during the invasion of Grenada, 1983, we invited Michael Manley, who was one of the few persons in the Caribbean who had come out against the invasion. We invited him up to Canada to speak to people about the situation, and it was really an overwhelming success. People from all over the place wanted to hear Michael Manley. And that is what the African Caribbean Forum did. We tried to bring together Caribbean and African people. I got back to St. Vincent and became involved in the non-governmental organization. There was a group called CARIPEDA, that is Caribbean People's Development Agency, which was a regional organization of NGOs, first started by CUSO, which was a Canadian Volunteer Association. And from then, I went to the University of the West Indies, open campus. It wasn't an open campus at all at that time, where I spend the rest of my time there, being involved to an extent in management, being head of that campus. It became a campus after. But I also participated in research, in lectures, giving lectures, not only in St. Vincent. I think I was looking at my CV and I probably did over 100 lectures in St. Vincent. I also did lectures in Curacao, in Antigua, in Guyana, just about every other Caribbean country. So that has been, my involvement. But I then decided to concentrate on working on the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Because what I found is that as I visited different libraries in different areas, and as I read West Indian history, very little was said about St. Vincent. A lot of attention was paid to the larger countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados. And there was so much that was interesting and unique about St. Vincent that I felt that needed to be brought into focus and put on the table. And it is out of that some of my books came, and I continue to do the research. I write a column in the Searchlight newspaper, and in that column, I occasionally introduce matters relating to the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and history generally. So in a nutshell, that is what it has been.
Right, because if I can remember from a little boy, because I migrated some 30-something years ago, I can vividly remember you being on the radio every morning talking about, giving us a little bit about the history, and it amazes me now that you're still contributing to feeding us with your knowledge about the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So for that, I want to say a big thank you up front for your
let me just say something about that. It was a program called From Whence We Came, which came over on the what we call a national radio station, the radio NBC, and it was Monday to Friday, 5 to 7 minutes every morning. And what I tried to do was to get people to understand their own history. So I dealt with a lot of names and a lot of things which people would be familiar with. And I realized it was having some success when once, and I've told the story already, I went to a restaurant, and while I was there waiting and being served, somebody came and said the cook wanted to see me, and I couldn't understand why the cook wanted to see me. So I went and she said, last week you spoke about such and such. She gave the name of that person was my great-great-grandfather. And then I realized, speaking to other people, that some of the things I said came home to them, because when we were doing history at school, it was mainly history of Britain. And you couldn't really identify with it. So what I tried to do From Whence We Came is to make it come home to people. So I'll mention names of places that people are familiar with, names of people, so that people could make that kind of identification. And, I was really glad. And that program went for about 7 years. 2 different patches over 7 years. Well, so I'm glad you reminded me about that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's the beauty of having people like you around that can really highlight our history. Let me go back to what you said about studying in Canada, because I noticed that back in the day, like there were a lot of people used to come to Canada to study, as opposed to now. I don't think we have that many. Was Canada the place to study at that time, in your time, or for studies?
Well, actually, what happened at that time is that the Canadian government offered scholarships to St. Vincent. So there were quite a number of scholarships, and a number of people, Bassey Alexander for one, he went up there, and quite a number of us went there. On the first occasion, I went with a scholarship from the Canadian government. But when I went back, I was strictly on my own and did some part-time teaching in order to be able to finance my way. And at that time, I was married and had, when I left St. Vincent, my son was just under a year, and he came up to meet me. My wife came up there too, and we had the twin girls after that. So apart from study, I also had to deal with relating to a family that was in the making. But Canada was then a place that a number of people went, not only because of the Canadian government scholarships, but it was easy at that time to get to Canada. And as we know, a lot of people in St. Vincent would have had relatives in North America generally, and would try and go there and study and also work. So it was an easy place for me to go.
Right. We got to get into a couple of stuff here. We got to get into your books. You wrote several books later. We're going to touch base on at least 2 of them, the content, so that people can know what the resources that are available for them to really update themselves. Because to be honest, like a lot of us Vincentians, especially those of us who have migrated, we don't really have a lot of Vincentian history. What we know is, like what you said, is what we heard from our foreparents and whatever, but the in-depth of it, you have highlighted most of it in a few of your books. I have your quote that you said, and concerning the history of St. Vincent, and to a larger extent that you had spread your wings a little bit over to the Caribbean. You said we're not fully aware of our amazing history. We're in the forefront of movement and development throughout our history. And I think you are pertaining to our people, Caribbean people in the height of history. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay. One of the things that stands out about St. Vincent is that, as I think a lot of us know, Christopher Columbus came to this part of the world in 1492, although when we were growing up, we were told that Christopher Columbus came to St. Vincent in 1498 on the 22nd of January, and we actually had that as a holiday, only to find out that Christopher Columbus never came to St. Vincent, and on the 22nd of January 1490, he was actually still in Spain. So that we were able to get rid of. But you started a movement against what we used to call the Carib people, but whom we now call the Kalinagos, that were the original inhabitants of St. Vincent when Christopher Columbus came to this part of the world. Because the word Carib was the word which Christopher Columbus gave to them. He said he heard it from the Taino people up north that these people were Caribs and they were criminal, they were cannibals and so on. So that name, that word had lived on for quite a long time. But today we know that the people never call themselves that. So we go back to Kalinagos, and then along with the Kalinagos are the Garifuna people, because what happened is that African, particularly in St. Vincent, slaves escaped from plantations in Barbados. And anyone who knows the geography and understands the region would know that it was quite easy to get to St. Vincent from Barbados. In fact, one person said that you just had to get on a boat or a log or something and you end up in St. Vincent. So a lot of the people who we now know as Garifuna and who mixed, these were the escaped slaves who mixed with these Kalinagos or the Carib people as they were called, became Garifuna. But there was also in the 17th century, and there's a difference sometimes in dates, people have different dates, when a ship, which was apparently going to Barbados with slaves, overturned or was shipwrecked, and the people were able to get to Bequia. And from Bequia, the indigenous people then, the Kalinagos, took them onto the mainland and they began to populate until at one time they became numerically more dominant than the original people who were there. So that was where the Garifuna, or what they call in history the Black Caribs, came about. And when most of the indigenous people had died out, well, with the exception of Dominica, where they were able to get a reserve and they were able to stay on this reserve, in St. Vincent, they remained for a long time. And in fact, the British began colonizing the Leeward Islands and Barbados in the 1620s and early 1630s. But it was not until 1763 that they were able to come into St. Vincent. So it meant that when sugar started being cultivated in the Caribbean from the 1640s, particularly in Barbados, St. Vincent was not as yet colonized by the British. They became colonized in 1763. And between 1763 and 1796, there were conflicts between the British and the Garifuna, who were then the dominant group, but the Garifuna and some Kalinagos who still remained. And it was, the two wars were fought, one from 1772 to 1773, and the other one from 1795, that is the war in which Chatoyer, who is now a national hero, was killed. So 1795 to 1796, eventually the British, they were able to, those persons who had surrendered or who had been captured, were sent to Badiso, awaiting shipment or banishment to Central America. And by April 1797, they were sent to a small island of Honduras called Roatan. And from Roatan, they then went to Belize, to Nicaragua, to Guatemala. So that today, the Garifuna population that went to the Central America there are now large numbers of them living in England, in the US, and well, not so much in Canada, but also in Canada, places like California and New York. So you have that group, and that group has been able to make a connection with St. Vincent. And one of the things which they have been trying to do is to see if they or get put some pressure on government to have Baliso as a museum or a national park in commemoration of their ancestors who died there. And I should have pointed out that about just under 5,000 people were taken to Baliso. But when they were ready to ship them to Roatan, there were only 2,000 and something. So a lot of them, more than half of them, died at Baliso. And that, you know, that was a problem. And that's why they want to have a memorial there in their honor. So you have that, and then the people who remained, and they never knew, the British never knew who remained, because many of them went into the interior, formed small villages. And there's only one occasion when they were able to capture some and got others to surrender. So I think 20-something to 30-something were given lands to the north of Walliboo in St. Vincent, an area called Monronde, and they were able to live there. But the others in places like Greg's and a number of other areas remained and settled there. I should also point out at this stage, in speaking about the uniqueness of St. Vincent, that the lands which these Garifuna, the indigenous people, had owned, once they had banished them, the government took over the lands and then sold them out as estates. So from that part of the country, from Rabaka right up to Fancy, the lands were owned by government and sold to estate owners. And incidentally, it was during that period that Georgetown became a town, because there was no Georgetown before this particular period. So you have a lot of estates, and this turned out to be the most productive estate, because after these lands were taken over and estates were formed, from about, well, they were shipped away, they were banished in 1797, but by 1805 to the early 1820s, St. Vincent was second to Jamaica in terms of the amount of sugar which they were able to export. So you have a country which was almost 100 years behind in terms of sugar production. But once they got into sugar production, especially with these new lands, virgin lands which were taken away from the Garifuna people, became a very productive country. And you know, so a lot of this is not known. And
Sure.
Apart from that, there are quite a number of other things about. So it meant that St. Vincent had the shortest period of slavery in the Caribbean. You know, while the others were fully into slavery, St. Vincent was not. You know, only part of the country had been from the 1760s enslaved. So that is one aspect of it. And there are a number of other things. For instance, people who would have done a history of the Caribbean would have heard of the Moran Bay Rebellion in 1865. But we had a rebellion in St. Vincent from 1862. And there are a number of other things, carnival rights in 1879, which preceded carnival rights in Trinidad. So you could point to quite a number of things. And one of the other things I would mention is that in St. Vincent, you had a situation where King Jaja of Nigeria was actually banished and brought to St. Vincent to live. He first of all lived in the area near to Fort Charlotte, and he also resided at Cobblestone Inn and other areas around. So he spent a while before he eventually was sent back to Nigeria. And on his way back to Nigeria, he died, so he was never able to get back to his homeland. So those are only a couple of the things where St. Vincent stands out. Okay.
So was it like he was living in exile in St. Vincent, or he just came on his own?
What happened is that he was involved in the palm oil business, and the British wanted to take over the palm oil business. So they actually tricked him, encouraged him, invited him on board to discuss matters related to palm oil, which was at that time very, very important product and very popular. And they simply took off with him and brought him to St. Vincent. He came along with his son and I think one attendant, and they came to St. Vincent in exile.
Dr. Fraser, it's amazing already that where we're going. I have to say that we have to invite you a second time again for Rock 2, because this is so interesting. So, and I can sit down here and listen to the history deep back. But we just want to touch on some key points. And then we're gonna come back. But not that I'm stopping you from, because I enjoy.
No, you go ahead. I'll just fit in. No problem.
Yeah, feel free to say deep down in our history, because that's what we want to do. We want to get the information out there. You know, my co-host is gonna come in soon, but before he comes in, I just want to fast forward to where St. Vincent, like a lot of us didn't know. First of all, let me just ask you this. So is it fair to say that the Garifuna or St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the home for the Garifuna, original home of the Garifuna?
Yeah, and this is what is also another thing that's exceptional about St. Vincent, because you don't have this happening anywhere, that people in the region are pointing to an area in the region saying that's the home of our ancestors. And I always mention, when I'm speaking about that, I always mention something that happened, because it still stands out in my mind, where we invited a Garifuna from Belize to come to St. Vincent. He was an artist and musician, and he was supposed to put on an exhibition. Now, I had sent him, I was at the university, had sent a taxi to pick him up. And the night, the taxi driver phoned me and asked, why did we send him to pick up this madman? So I couldn't understand what was happening. So next day when I met the guy, I said, what happened to you yesterday? He said, and when I was growing up, my parents and grandparents were telling me about St. Vincent, from where our ancestors came. And he said, I always wanted to come to St. Vincent. He said, when I got off the plane and I touched the ground, I could not hold myself. He got into the taxi and he started beating his drums, and he had a guitar or something. He started, and this taxi driver, who didn't know what was going on, just figured that we sent him to pick up a madman. But the thing is that a lot of the people in Belize in particular, I'm using Belize because Belize, they speak English, and our communication is much easier. So a lot of people knew about St. Vincent, and a lot of them really want to go to St. Vincent, where their ancestors came from. So yes, St. Vincent is the home of.
So hold on 1 second. So what is it a coincidence that the Chatoyer River is the beginning of the Garifuna sector, or is just happened to be there, like they happened to choose? What reason were there? What reason is it why they ended up from the Chatoyer River going north towards north?
Well, the thing is that, okay, this happened in 1812. There was an eruption of the volcano. And up to then, well, by that time, the estates in that area were very productive. Rabaca, you know, Bansabo, all of those. But in 1812, you had a situation where the flow of the water was blocked by lava from the volcano. So the water went underground. And as you would know in St. Vincent, only when it rained a lot, you then had the water running. So the Rabaca became a sort of barrier for quite a long time. I remember being at the Rabaca, waiting to get over on the other side, and you had to wait until the rain had stopped and the place had dried out before you were able to move. So before 1812, the Rabaca was one of the biggest rivers in St. Vincent. But it so happened that this is the area where the indigenous people came from. And it acted as a barrier in a sense, because it was not easy to get from Kingston, even from Georgetown to places like Fancy. So it was just incidental. And I think what would have happened to us, we see in the recent rains, I've been seeing pictures of the overland area where there's flooding. And what has happened is that the indigenous people were able to live in these areas without any problems. But once the British came in and they began to produce sugar, they cut down a lot of the trees and the forests and so on. So it made it easy for water to escape and to create problems. And that is what we have in today.
And for what I see, it works out perfect because if you look at the way indigenous people live, they always like to be separate from the rest of the country. So the Rabukadra River would have served really as a border, pretty much, where you can say that side you will find most of the indigenous people. Am I correct?
Well, in a sense, what happened is that area where they lived was the most productive area, and the British wanted to get those lands. So they felt very secure where they lived because the British weren't able to get into their lands. And they felt quite secure until, the majority of them were banished and then those lands disappeared from them. In fact, the indigenous people were never slaves. But what happened after the bulk of them were banished from St. Vincent is that those who remained, they were able to occupy some of those lands on condition that they provided service to the estate owners. So the indigenous people, the Black Caribs and the Kalinagos and the Garifuna, they were export seamen. In fact, the British said that you could never drown one of these people. They were so dexterous in the water. And what happened is that when the ships came to that area, Georgetown and areas around it, as you know, that area is very rough. But the Garifuna were able to take the sugar in their canoes out to the ships which remained offshore. That is why, for instance, you have Black Point Tunnel, because the person who owned Grand Sable Estate built a tunnel between the Georgetown area and the Byra area, because it was felt that the Byra area was calm. And so the sugar would go through there. The Garifuna people then took the sugar to the ships outside. So, that's how that tied in.
All right, so I'll pass it to the Byra man.
Dr. Adrian Fraser.
Yes, sir.
I'm the son of a former headmaster. And one of the things he did was to give us your book, and we read the book. So you're going to continue where you left off. I'm originally from Byra Hill, and that is going to be my first question, where you ended, about the tunnel at Grand Sable. Yeah, so that tunnel was built by the proprietor. Brown was his name, Reverend Brown, and he used that, as I said, simply to get the sugar across from the Grand Sable area to the Byra area, and then the canoes would take the sugar out to sea. So that became very important to them at that particular point. In fact, that area from Byra to the rest of the north, those are important areas for the Garifuna people who were living there at that time, because that is where they owned that property, and that is what the British wanted to get into that, and they struggled for quite a long time to be able to maintain control of this particular area. Because when I was growing up, when the water was calm, say in the summertime, there were actually a wharf. Yeah. There that goes out. So I was wondering, what's the reason for the wharf? Because now that I think there are a lot of stones there, so it partly covered the wharf. So that's the reason for the wharf. Then. Yeah, there was a wharf there which was being used, but the eruptions and the hurricanes and so on really destroyed that wharf. Yeah. So in that time, the Garifuna people they did their thing and just took the sugar out for them, Yeah, because the still is, the last time I went home was about 3 years or so. When I visited the area, there's still water inside. Always water inside. I don't know if you are in your history books, if you really mention about that, but there's always water inside there. Yeah, that was the nature of the whole thing. And in fact,
Well, they have done some work in recent years on rehabilitating the tunnel, because when I first went to the tunnel, it was the most scariest part of my time. You had to actually bend down because there were bats flying all across the place. You know, it was really, really frightening to be able to encounter all of it, because it was there for a long time, not being used, and the bats congregated there. Now, you know, a lot of that they've been able to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's one of the things you remind me of. In my younger days, going through there, you have to at least crawl on your feet and your hands to go through, because the bats was like invaded the place, and now I think when I went with it, it's really a nice tourist attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had the water there too, which had come in here.
Yeah. Outside that night, your first book about St. Vincent and the Grenadines, your compilation. How much work do you think you did to really get that book up to that level? Because I read that book so many times because my father was a headmaster, and one thing he always had is like we had a library at home. So how much work went into that as such to get it to where it was?
Well, let me say first of all that the first set of books I did were books for use by primary school students, and they were called Caribbean Social Studies. The first one I did with Keith Joseph, and the second one was one which was to encourage the students to participate. So there were questions asked at the end of it. So there were two books on Caribbean Social Studies. I know they still use the one, Primary Social Studies for the Caribbean, but St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because this was produced by Macmillan, and each of the countries, I think, has one of those. Then around the time when they were going to make Chatoyer national hero, I realized that not many people knew very much about Chatoyer. So what I did was to produce a small booklet, Chatoyer National Hero of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it was done really just to give people some knowledge of who Chatoyer was really about. The whole idea of making Chatoyer a national hero started with the National Youth Council. And I participated in a lot of their programs where they went to different communities speaking about Chatoyer. And when it was decided to have a national hero, Chatoyer was almost the natural choice. Then following that, I had a book on the Shakers, from Shakers to Spiritual Baptists. Now we would know.
Hold it up a little bit. You can hold it up a little bit more, Dr. Fraser, yeah. So,
yeah, we will know about the Shakers. Today they are called the Spiritual Baptists. And I had always had an interest in the Shakers, because as a young boy going to school, you'd hear people ringing the bells. They're calling people who were coming out to attend the Shakers meeting, and the Shakers meeting went on very late. But in Barley, at an area called Nugent, mountain area, where we had some land, I noticed that there was a Shaker prayer house. And I was wondering, why would they have a Shaker prayer house there? It's only later on I realized that what happened is that the Shaker religion was banned in St. Vincent. And the law prevented them from having meetings anywhere in the town. So they had to find remote areas in the country in order to have their meetings. So from very early, I had an interest in that. And then I came across information, and here's where George McIntosh attempted to get the ban removed, the ban against the practice of the Shaker religion. And it was through George McIntosh that the name Spiritual Baptist came, because the law stated Shakers, and McIntosh felt that he would go get around this by saying these people are no longer call themselves Shakers, they're Spiritual Baptists. But he fought a long struggle in order for the Shakers, as they were called then, to be able to practice their religion. And the Constitution at that time created a lot of problems for him. It was not until after he left the scene and E.T. Joshua came that E.T. Joshua, and by then the constitution had changed, and E.T. Joshua was able to get them to remove the ban on the Shaker religion. So when I did From Shakers to Spiritual Baptists, it was an effort to let the Shakers people know that they had a rich history and that they needed to inform themselves about their own history. So that was the reason for From Shakers to Spiritual Baptists. And then the other book, the next book I did was the 1935 riots in St. Vincent. Now, the 1930s was a very important period in the history of the Caribbean. There were riots and disturbances in a number of Caribbean countries. And traditionally, it is said that the force of these riots started in St. Kitts in January, and then you have the next one in St. Vincent in October. And the 1930s was a time when there was a lot of economic hardship. It was the time of the Great Depression. There was a lot of economic hardship, and people throughout the region were feeling it. But one of the reasons for writing this book on the 1935 riots is that when you checked on the other areas that had riots, most of these riots were on the plantations or on the estates. In the case of St. Vincent, the riots took place in the courtyard where the Legislative Council was meeting, and they were going to pass laws to increase revenue. And people know very much that one of the things they did was to try to increase the price of matches. And people, of course, that time people had their coal pots and so on. Matches is very important to them. So in the case of St. Vincent, it started in the courthouse. People who went to the market on Saturdays, and George McIntosh had a pharmacy in the middle street near to where the Grenadines have their supermarket. And after they left the market, on the way home, they would pass in a George McIntosh and buy things to carry home. And what McIntosh was able to do is that some of the medication that people use, Limacol and so on, he was able to make substitutes, Vincentian substitutes. So people would go to McIntosh. So when they heard about these increases in prices, particularly on matches, they went to McIntosh and asked McIntosh if he could make a plea for them with the governor. The governor at that time lived in Grenada, because we then had what is called the Windward Islands, and Grenada was the center where the governor lived. So when the Legislative Council was meeting, McIntosh went in. He was able to see the governor for a brief moment and said, "I am asked to make representation on behalf of these people." So the governor said, "Yeah, but I will see them, but at 5 o'clock in the afternoon." When McIntosh went outside, and by that time, the courtyard was crowded with people. When McIntosh went out and told them that the governor would meet with them, but at 5 o'clock, they said, no, because they felt that the governor stricken them, that the governor had intended going back to Grenada that afternoon. So unless they confronted the governor, then everything would be. So while the meeting was going on, people kept coming in and all sorts of things were happening there, and the riot broke out. They had to end the meeting of the Legislative Council. The governor was able to meet with some of them after, but then things had gotten out of control because people were shot, some people were killed. And from the courthouse, they went through the middle street where there were problems, people breaking into stores. Then there were problems going up to past the Catholic Church, going up to that area. And one of the members of the Legislative Council lived in that area. The police were able to get rid of them, but also they went up to Cane Garden, and you had another riot there where they broke, where the rioters were able to get into some houses, and some of the people who were walking in these houses actually had to scramble and get out. Then later that afternoon, they got a call saying that there were disturbances in Georgetown. So the police at about midnight was sent out to Georgetown. They found evidence of people cutting telephone wires and so on, so that they could break the communication between Georgetown and Kingston. The people on some of the estates were very agitated, and they were eventually able to calm things down while arresting some of the people. But the next day, there were also disturbances in Camden Park. And it was said that in the case of Camden Park, one of the gentlemen who owned a store in Camden Park had lent some of his bullets to one of the volunteers, military volunteers in Kingston. And they stormed the guy's building saying, "You have lent bullets to this man to kill Black people." And the thing escalated in Camden Park until eventually it was brought under control. But the British, the way they felt, they had no regard for the ordinary people. And they felt that the ordinary people could not have organized something like it. There had to be some big man, some big brain behind it. So they held on to McIntosh, who absolutely was only assisting the people. McIntosh was put on trial, and he was represented by a lawyer from Trinidad who came. And after a couple of days, the lawyer said, "This thing is ridiculous, because every witness you bring up here is testifying to the fact that McIntosh is innocent." So they were able to, they dismissed the case. And when the people outside heard that McIntosh was released, they picked up McIntosh on their shoulders and took McIntosh to his home. And that was the beginning of McIntosh's involvement in politics, because McIntosh decided to form an organization. And once that organization was formed, they were able to get into the Legislative Council. And between 1937 and 1951, when you had adult suffrage, McIntosh was one of the leading political figures in St. Vincent. So that is about the riots. But in that book on the riots, I dealt a lot with the economic, social, and political situation in St. Vincent to give people an understanding of what was happening in St. Vincent at that particular time.
And was living in Paws Avenue at that time?
Yeah. And in fact, I should say that McIntosh had been so committed to the Shaker that even when they banned the Shaker religion from being practiced in Kingston, McIntosh offered his yard in Paul's lot. He said, "Come in and have your Shaker religion." So people went in there and the religion, and they were able to have their meetings, you know. So he was totally committed to them, but he lived in Paul's at that time.
Not a history about the spiritual Baptist, because my grandfather was a spiritual leader. So
what's his name?
That was John Warren.
Okay, because I have the names of a number of the leaders and some of their prayer houses and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the prayer house is still there if it's not demolished right now, but that's my mother's father.
Okay,
so
okay.
I used to go around by him, you know. I used to like history a lot. So I used to go around by him and get all the historical thing about the spiritual Baptist. So
yeah,
I learned a lot from that. But we cannot leave you with one. You have to come back here sometime. But in the meantime, I'm gonna pass it back to the host, Mr. Morton Sayers.
Okay. Morton, I didn't mention the last book I did, From Villain to National Hero. Chateau and the early struggle for the independence of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Because the point I was making in this book is that the first person who led the struggle against colonialism and for the independence of St. Vincent was actually Chateau. So I was able to trace it back to Chateau until he became national hero, to show why the role that Chateau played in independence, securing the independence of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Yeah. Dr. Fraser, don't worry, we're not done. We just pass it back to me. We go back and forth. So
okay.
We have a lot to cover. But since let me just reintroduce you to our listeners. We're having a conversation with prominent Vincentian historian Dr. Adrian Fraser, historian, author, lecturer, all of the above, many accolades behind his name. Dr. Fraser, since we're talking all in all about Chatoyer, and our listeners might observe that you've been saying Chatoyer and not the famous Joseph Chatoyer that people are known to be calling him Joseph. If you can just elaborate a little bit on the reason why you're calling him Chatoyer, because I know you mentioned in one of your books you just kept calling him Chatoyer, and as opposed to Joseph Chatoyer. So if you can just tell our audience why the name Joseph Chatoyer was eliminated from your vocabulary, at least.
Well, the thing is that I'm glad that you picked that up, because I have never come, except in one occasion, I came across the name Joseph, because they were always called by a single name. And all the documents I've seen refer to him as Chatoyer. I don't know where the Joseph came in. And of course, what had happened is that you had the Caribs, the indigenous people, being associated at one time with the French and at another time with the British. In fact, I mentioned those two wars fought between the British and the indigenous people. But between 1779 and 1783, the French were able to capture St. Vincent with the help of the indigenous people. And I don't know if in that thing the name Joseph, but I have only seen it on one occasion. So I refer to him as Chateau, which is the name I know him by. And I intend to continue to look to try to trace where this Joseph came from.
Right. Since we're in Chateau again, I'm going to surround most of the questions towards that right now until we get back on another subject. So for Chatoyer, is he really like a Vincentian, or because we don't know any name growing up, I don't know any surname or ever by the name of Chatoyer. So why does he have family in St. Vincent? Is there a connection with St. Vincent, a blood family, with anyone from St. Vincent?
Yeah, Chatoyer is Vincentian. What happened is that we have to remember that a number of people, most of the Garifuna people, were exiled from St. Vincent. And his son, we know, who, when Chatoyer died, his son was one of the leaders, and his son was actually on one of the boats that carried him away from St. Vincent. There is, they found a woman in Belize who descended from Chatoyer. And the person the woman, she was able to tell her story, and her story was handed down over through her family over the years. And one of the other things, which always makes it difficult when you're dealing with indigenous people, is that these people never told their story. And I have in my office here, in my study, something which says, until the lions have their historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. And this is one of the problems we came across, or which we come across, trying to deal with the indigenous people, that they never left their story. Their story was told by the people who won the war, and they gave their own version of it. So in researching that, we come up against a lot of stuff, some of it which we know not correct, but they were telling their story. The Garifuna and the indigenous people were not able to tell their stories. So one of the important things we have been able to find from some of those people who were exiled or who were banished to Central America is that some of them were able to report their stories. The other important thing when researching these indigenous people is that we have grown up looking at the British version of things. Now we are getting more and more French sources, and these French sources are translated into English. And we realize that the French have a different version of a number of these things. And the French were always closer to the indigenous people than were the British. So that a number of things we have to really look at again, and we are able to compare the French version with the British version. And I'll give you a good example. An 18-year-old French person was sent to St. Vincent during the time of that second war between 1795 and 1796. And his job was to assist the Garifuna and the Kalinago people in the use of weaponry and preparing them for battle against the British. And one of the things he pointed out, because he wrote his story sometime after, and he said he played up the role of the Garifuna and Kalinago women. He said that some of them were some of the best marks people, marks people you could find. And in the British, they made no mention of the women being involved in these wars, but according to the French, they were an essential part. In fact, this guy said he named occasion on which one of the Garifuna ladies, who was the daughter of a Kalinago chief, was able to save him from being shot in one of the encounters they had with the British. So that so a lot of those things are changing, and with the fact that the French version is now more visible to us, we are able to tap into the French version. We are able to pick up a different slant to the story. And I'm not saying that we also have to bear in mind that the French would also have had their own biases, but you're able to look at both of them and to make the kind of comparison that you could make. So those are some of the difficulties that these people, I mean, they left their petroglyphs and they're writing their things on the petroglyph, which we still don't know what they mean. But in terms of actual writing, there wasn't such. So that is one of the difficulties. And this is why I say, until the lions have their own historian, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. So it means that the British who are fighting them, they're telling their story, but those people who were pushed out of St. Vincent were not able to tell their story.
And you also mentioned from, I think it's from Villain to Here,
Yeah.
that the slaves made a difference in the war. The slaves from Martinique and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And they were also called the Rangers.
Yeah.
What role did they play that was so instrumental in that victory?
Yeah, first of all, there were slaves fighting on both sides, because some of the plantation owners made their slaves available to the British, although some of them were very skeptical as to what they might eventually do. But the British now, one of the reasons why the indigenous people were able to hold out for so long is that they fought a different battle. They fought what today we call guerrilla warfare, where they would ambush the British, they would hide in the bush, on trees, and the British were annoyed because they were accustomed fighting battles where they come head on with their enemies and they could fight them. But when you have this kind of guerrilla warfare, it was difficult for them. Now, the British did not want to go in the interior because they were not familiar with the interior. So what they did, they got some of the slaves and they formed the St. Vincent Rangers in order to try to go into the interior and destroy the provision grounds of these people. But while that was happening, the French were also sending some of their, enslaved people, freed people, because the French had actually, after the revolution in France, they had actually freed their slaves. So they were able to send over some of these freed slaves to St. Vincent to participate in the war, and they fought on behalf of the Garifuna. There were also French Creoles, that is, or French mulattoes, mixture of mixed people, and also French people who were involved in the revolution in France and who wanted to see these people freed from the enslavement. So you had slaves fighting on both sides. But it was important to the British to get these people into the Rangers so that they could get into the, that did not work in the early stages because some of them actually refused to go. But in the end, one of the reasons why the indigenous people were defeated is that they were able to go in, some of them were able to get in and to destroy the provision grounds. And what the British did also, they were able to put a blockade on to prevent the boats from, particularly from that Grand Sable area, from going to St. Lucia and Martinique, where the French would have been supplying them with weapons and ammunition and also people. So that is what was happening. You had people on both sides fighting, some of the same kind of people fighting.
Right. So, Dr. Fraser, for those of us who might be a little bit innocent about Chatoyer, in a nutshell, who was Joseph? Who was Chatoyer? That was a Joseph. Who was Chatoyer? How would you describe him in a nutshell for someone who's not so acquainted with him? Because in your book, Villain to Hero, it's about Chatoyer. So, and if you can just, if you want, you can just show our viewers your book. The one Villain to Chatoyer to Hero, Villain to Hero, and it's about Chatoyer and how he fought. So, in a nutshell, just tell us how you would summarize Chatoyer. Sorry.
Okay, actually, we know very little about the personal life of Chatoyer. The book deals with Chatoyer's involvement in the struggle, and he was really the mastermind. He was the chief strategist. And in fact, the French had developed so much confidence in Chatoyer that they were prepared to put a lot of things in the hands of Chatoyer. So from the first encounter the British had with the indigenous people was a few years after they took control of St. Vincent, and the person who was leading the struggle from the very beginning was Chatoyer. Now, we still don't know how Chatoyer was selected. And it is felt that it was based on their performance in struggles before. But what the British knew and the French knew is that he was an exceptionally good leader. He was able to hold the forces together. As I said, he was a chief strategist and apparently organized the kind of campaign against the British. So we know about Chatoyer in that capacity, and he led the struggle up to 1795. But at the same time, what we have to remember is that although we have singled out Chatoyer because he was the chief strategist and leader in that sense, he is called the paramount chief, everything did not depend on him, because when he died, the people were able to continue the struggle for at least another year without Chatoyer. But he had laid the groundwork, and the British came to respect him. They realized that he is the man they had to deal with if they were going to do anything at all. And which brings me to the question of Chatoyer's death. And what we were told, and the early history book said that Chatoyer died in a duel with a Major Leach. Now, this struggle, when Chatoyer was killed, would have taken place after 12 in the night. And the question you have to ask is, why would Chatoyer want to fight a duel at that hour in the dark of the night? But when you look at other information, what happened is that on the day when Chatoyer was killed, they were actually planning to overtake Kingston. They had gotten as far as Duvalet, his brother, came from the eastern side in north, and Chatoyer came from the Chateau area. They met and got to Dorsetshire Hill, where they took over the fort that was there, and were planning to attack Kingston the next day. The governor realized that if they didn't do anything quickly, that these people would overtake Kingston. Fortunately, he had some help. Some ships were in the harbor, and he was able to bring together the troops he had. And what they did is to ambush Chatoyer, because they left Sand Hill at about 12 o'clock at night, and they walked up to the fort at Dorset Hill. And the Chatoyer and the others were not aware of this until they were within about 80 yards of where the fort was. And then they realized that they were under attack. Within minutes, the British troops then pulled out their guns and started firing. So Chatoyer, in that process, was hit, was injured, and while he was on the ground, as one person who claimed to have been part of it said, while he was on the ground, Major Leet and others came and punched their daggers or whatever into Chatoyer's body. So there was never any fight between Chatoyer and Major Leet. What the British did, and this is probably for propaganda purposes, they were able to put out the story that Major Leet killed their chief in a battle. And as we know, this was something was put in the stone commemorating the victory of Major Leet, was put in the church, Anglican church, which was the church of the British, and it is now covered over and by a carpet, but it still remains there in honor of Chatoyer. But that story, we now know it's never true, that Chatoyer fell victim to an ambush. And a number of his people were killed, because normally what the indigenous people did is that anytime any of their people was killed, they would take them away. But the circumstances, given the hour of the day, never allowed that to happen. And nobody at this stage knows where Chatoyer's body is.
Mm-hmm. Right, so that would lead me to my next question. Would it be fair to say then that, because I know a certain group has been lobbying or trying to get Chatoyer to replace the famous Iron Man in Kingston as our historical statue. Is it fair to say that, or what would be your opinion if that was to happen, or in terms of lobbying for Chatoyer to be our iconic historical structure in Kingston?
Well, I don't think it's not a matter of replacing, but I think we need to find a prominent place to display Chatoyer. I mean, where he's up at Dorset Hill, not many people would see it. So it has to be at a very prominent place in Kingston. And I think they should also have some replicas in some of the areas where Chatoyer fought, but certainly in Kingston, he needs to be prominently displayed. And so instead of, I don't think it makes any sense just replacing what is there by Chatoyer, but let's find a prominent place and put Chatoyer and give him the kind of respect he is due as our national hero, as our first national hero.
Okay, and talking about national hero, when the government made the citation surrounding Chatoyer being the national hero, I think you personally discovered some discrepancies surrounding that. Can you just shed a little bit of light on what you discovered concerning that citation? Yeah,
the citation referred, I don't know how this came about, but it referred to him as a Kalinago chief. Chatoyer was not a Kalinago chief, he was a Garifuna chief. But one of the problems with the Garifuna and Kalinago is that now these people, since the 17th century, they had been cohabiting, intermarrying, and so on. So by that period, it is difficult to say who was Black Carib or who was Yellow Carib. Genetics, and you could see somebody whose color is completely different, or who is of the same genetic kind. And so they call, just by looking at them, they say this person is Yellow Carib and that person is Black Carib, and it's difficult to do that. But in any event, by the time Chatoyer came on the scene and these battles started, the Kalinago, who were the original Caribs, and to use the Carib in Bolivia, many of them had died off. So the majority of people in St. Vincent were actually the Garifuna people. And today, some of the people who call themselves Kalinago are actually Garifuna. They're mixed, and they've been doing genetic studies to show the kind of mixture that is involved. But we continue to use the old name because these are the names etched in the history, and we continue to use that. But to all intents and purposes, these people were mixed, and they were actually Garifuna, or Black Carib, as the history says.
So I'm still a little bit confused just before CP is going to come in, but the Kalinago, so the Garifuna are the ones that were mixed with the Blacks.
Yeah.
Right. And the Kalinago
were the original people who were there, and they were able to mix with these escaped slaves, or in the case of those who were shipwrecked, they cohabited with them, and their children then became what is known as Garifuna. They were not totally African, but they were a mixture of African and Indian.
Okay, so Caribs is basically a nickname for the Garifuna.
Well, it isn't a nickname because it carried serious connotations in that because of this connotation with cannibalism, and some of the textbooks continue to call them Caribs. And throughout the years, the indigenous people in St. Vincent have suffered because they go to school and they were told that their ancestors, they are descended from people who were cannibals, and there's no evidence that was so. So it's not only a nickname, but it had serious consequences.
Derogative.
Yeah.
So.
You listen to the Freshman Song. You listen to Vincent Internet Radio. We're having a discussion with Dr. Adrian Fraser. He's a historian, an author, and a lecturer about the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, coming in West Indian, we should say. Dr. Fraser, I'm gonna take you a little bit back now to the educational side, and continue with you when you came back up to Canada with your studies. Tell us a little bit about when you came back to Canada, about your studies.
Yeah, okay. When I first went to Canada, did a first degree, returned to St. Vincent, and started teaching at the grammar school. And during the period when I came back to St. Vincent, I'd taken 2 years to go to Barbados and did studies. At that time, my interest was in the farmers and peasants, because when you look at the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the people who really kept the country going were farmers and peasants. By the end of the 19th century, by the 1890s, by 1899 in particular, sugar was almost done. And sugar was replaced by cotton and by arrowroot. And the people, while the farmers and peasants could not produce sugar, because sugar needed large plantations, they needed a lot of capital, on their own small acres of land, they could plant cotton and arrowroot. And what they did was to plant cotton and arrowroot, and they actually sold some of these to the proprietors because they had the mills and so on, and they could. So when you see the produce coming out of St. Vincent, and some of them are attributed to the estate, many of them really came from the small farmers and peasants. So you had the development of a peasantry and a small farmers community, but they had to undergo a period of struggle because the British realized that the planters in particular realized that, first of all, they wanted these people to remain on the estates in order to work for them. So they tried to prevent them from getting land. And one of the difficulties they had is that even when they were able to squat on land in the interior, there's a problem getting the produce from the interior to the markets. So that struggle went on for a long period of time. But some of the estate owners or proprietors, when they got into financial difficulties, what they would do is to rent out a piece of land on the borders of their estate, rent it out to the laborers, who then did their own stuff. But knowing the planters realized that anytime they wanted money, they would make themselves available to the estate. So that went on until people were able over the years to buy some of this land. And that is why when you look at the names of villages in St. Vincent, a lot of these villages came out of the names of estates. You know, they were originally estates, or part of the lands were taken over or rented by the laborers on the estates. And eventually when enough of them were able to own the lands, it then became such and such village rather than the name of the estate. So that went on. And by the 1890s, there was large unemployment in St. Vincent. Sugar was virtually dead. And at the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, you had perhaps one of the largest and most destructive hurricanes ever to come to St. Vincent, the 1898 hurricane. But you also had some storms during the 1880s and 1890s. And in 1899, when the government feared that there would be rebellion by the people, they started a land settlement program. This land settlement program had actually been recommended by a commission which they had brought to the Caribbean. But in this report of the commission, they said, in terms of St. Vincent, it is important that a land settlement program be introduced. So in 1899, a number of the estates on the leeward side of the island were taken over as part of a land settlement program. And that program went on. In fact, when you had the 1902 eruption, you had people from Sandy Bay. The government had to buy acres of lands at Camden Park in order to house these people from Sandy Bay. They also used other areas. And by 1911, Sandy Bay became a land settlement area, which allowed people to live there. Fancy was not taken over by government until the 1960s, until 1960. That is part of Joshua was able to do that in 1960. So you had this land settlement development. The planters fought against it, but eventually that, and you had a crown land scheme. We don't hear very much about the crown land scheme now, but you had a time when people were able to rent these crown lands. And so that is what happened. But these people then began to produce a lot of the cotton and the arrowroot. And in fact, from about the 1840s, St. Vincent was actually producing provision and a number of things, sending them to places like Trinidad and Barbados. So today, where we have these people carrying their goods to Trinidad and Barbados, it's not a new thing. That had existed for quite a long time. So I pay a lot of attention to these peasants and small farmers. And when I was doing my work, my master's degree was on the peasants and small farmers from the period when slavery ended until 1899, when you had the land settlement scheme. And then later on, when I did my PhD, I went from 1899 to 1951, when St. Vincent when we had adult suffrage, and the ordinary man and woman could then vote. They didn't have to own land to be able to vote. Another thing about the ownership of land is that unless you own land, you're really nobody. You could not vote, you could not participate in a number of things. So that was also an incentive for people to own land, but they put difficulties in the hands of these people.
So I'm trying to understand a little bit, because in my area, the estate was called Mount William Estate.
Yeah.
And out of that come Byra Hill. So as part of that, trying to get what you say now, most of the village name came originally out from the estate areas.
Yeah. Well,
So-
you had it, Mount William Estate continued for quite a long time. And in fact, Mount William was one of the estates, when they had riots in that area in 1862, Mount William was one of the estates that had been involved. At that time, I'm trying to remember the person who owned Mount William. I think it would have been one of the Hadleys.
The Hadleys, yeah.
And what there were some of them who played some of the proprietors who played a very important part, because even during the 1935 riots, they were able to provide some of the workers on the estate with a cricket field. And cricket was very important to these workers. In fact, the proprietors normally would be the ones going out to bat, and the workers would be the ones bowling at them. But they attached a lot of importance to cricket at that time. I think Mount William was one of the areas where they assisted them in getting a cricket field.
That is the Goss playing field.
Goss. Yeah, the Goss playing field, yeah.
I remember as a little boy going around there and watching the Mount William team play other teams from different places, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the Mount Bentic and those estates had playing fields.
So you're bringing back a lot of my historical days when I was growing up.
Yes.
That's why I have to bring it back, because this is only part one of it. And there's so much to learn, and really thank you. We're not finished yet, but I'm really trying to thank you for being here, to share something, because what we try to do on this program is basically to get people go in depth into things so that we could have something that people can refer back to, because there's not a lot that we know about St. Vincent. Even some of our maybe cultural people and all those kind of stuff, there's not too many information about. So I'm really going to thank you for coming, but we're not finished yet.
No, I'm happy anytime you just call on me once. We're not time, I'll be.
Yeah, so another thing we talk about is the spiritual Baptist.
Yeah.
My grandfather was a spiritual Baptist. Can you go in depth a little bit more so that people could understand the changes from what they call Shakers to spiritual Baptists? Because that seems to sometimes cause a conflict between people. Is he a Shaker or he's a spiritual Baptist?
Yeah. Now, the first evidence we have of these people was that in the 1840s. And what it appears to me is that this religion was being practiced on the estate during slavery. So it was only when slavery was abolished and people started moving away from the estates that they began to make themselves visible. And you had, within a short period of time, these spiritual Baptist prayer houses functioning in quite a number of different areas. And because they were attracting so many people, the churches were very concerned. In fact, a number of the Shakers at that time became members of the Methodist Church, but their system of prayers and so on did not fall into what the Methodists were doing. So in some cases, they were thrown out of the church and so on. But they tried to present a lot of evidence against these Shakers. And what they said, one of the things they said is that they were remnants of African barbarism. That would appeal to some of the people who wanted to get rid of them. So letters in the newspaper preached on some of the pulpits, and the whole idea was to get rid of them. So eventually, in 1812, I think it was, a law was passed banishing the Shakers. Now, McIntosh, when he got into power, well, I shouldn't say into power, when he got into the Legislative Council in the 1830s, immediately took up their cause. And he was saying, you're banishing these people simply because they're black. You're allowing all sorts of people to come into the country and practice their religion, and nothing is said about them. But because of these poor black people, this is your attitude to them. And McIntosh said, if I have to come here 1,000,000 times, I would come and advocate on their behalf. So began that long struggle. And at one stage, Mackintosh realized that this ban is a ban on the Shaker religion. So he got them to agree to change their religion from Shaker to spiritual Baptist. And that is how the spiritual Baptist thing came about. Afterward, it was accepted. And so there was a lot of, even after they were banned, there were a lot of, for instance, I'll give you an example. Word got to the police, so on, about somebody practicing Shakerism at a particular home. When they went into this home, they met a woman on the bed and her husband kneeling, praying for the woman. Apparently the woman was sick and he was praying for the woman. And they said, that is a sign that these people are Shakers. And they arrested a number of people. They didn't know who a Shaker was because in the law itself, they couldn't define a Shaker. So they said it's left up to the magistrates to decide who is Shaker. So the whole thing, because they knew very little about the Shakers. And that went on. A number of people were arrested and charged. But even before Mackintosh, the Shakers themselves were trying their best to fight against this ban. It went on, and they were able to hold marches. In fact, there was a big march in Georgetown, I think in 1949, 1950, when a lot of the Shaker people came out, and Mackintosh said, well, we had a big rally in Georgetown. You didn't ban us. Why are you attempting to do that now? So there's a lot involved in that. But the important thing is eventually they got rid of the ban, and the people officially regarded themselves as spiritual Baptists rather than Shakers. And you then had similar movements particularly in Trinidad, where they had a group called the Shout as well. In St. Vincent, they were called the Baptists, the Shakers. In St. Vincent, group was called the Shouters. And the people in Trinidad actually felt that these Shouters were people who came from St. Vincent after the ban. But apparently, independent of St. Vincent, they were a similar group in Trinidad. And then later on, it's like Barbados, you had the spiritual Baptists. So they went through a period of struggle. And that is where, as I said, I realized that people had a certain attitude to the Baptists that only certain kind of people we want to associate with the Baptists. So that is why I wrote the Baptists, to show that they had a rich history and to show how the name moved from Shaker to spiritual Baptist.
In case you just joined us, we're having a conversation with prominent historian, lecturer, Dr. Adrian Fraser. Dr. Fraser, feel free to reference whatever you're saying towards your books, because we know you have multiple books. So feel free anytime you talk as often as you want. So people who want additional information can know that it's at least out there for them to purchase, because many a times.
Let me just say that some of these books for people in St. Vincent could be had at the Games bookstore, but it is also available on Amazon, and people could just go into Amazon and get these. I think all of them are available on Amazon, except the first one, which is really, as I said, was really done to give people some idea of who Chatoyer, who they are going to be making an Australia, who Chatoyer was.
All right, so we'll give you a chance at the end of the program anyways, so that you can tell people, and at least if they can't find it anywhere, where they can hit you up on Facebook or the social media. I just want to reinforce what I said earlier on with you covering, a wider aspect of history, and through one of your launching of one of your book, I learned that in Montreal, Canada, there was a riot, and like the point I want to reiterate is that you said that Caribbean people are involved in more history than we really think we are, and you mentioned about the 1968 riot with the student at the Sir George Williams University, which is now a part of the Concordia University. And there were 8 Caribbean people, and I think 3 Vincentians were involved. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what happened there?
It's a long story, and I can't remember some of it, but
yeah, just a nutshell of what
that, because one of the persons who had been involved in that and who eventually came back to the region, Errol Thomas was his name. He was a lawyer, became a magistrate and judge. He actually died about 3 days ago. He was one of the persons who had been involved. There was a group of them. Some of them were not actually there at the scene when things happened, but it came out of racial remarks by one of the professors. And a number of Vincentans were involved. I mean, even Annie Eustace would have been part of it. Alfie Roberts, who died. Alfie Roberts, one of our cricketers who died. Then Errol Thomas, and there are a couple others whose name. But a lot of what we are mentioning, students going to Canada. A number of them, particularly in Montreal, have gone to Montreal and had been studying at that university at that particular time. And it was a time around getting into the Black Power movement and so on. And these racist remarks by this professor, it was felt that it should not be left unchallenged, and so everything grew out of that. They attempt to challenge and to identify this guy as a racist in his whole approach to some of the students who were there. So that happened in you have people like Rosie Douglas, who was a part of that, and Rosie Douglas came out of that, went back to Dominic and became leader of Dominic Prime Minister. And a few others, there were some who went elsewhere, but that was an important period, and it added to what was going on in the region, because in the region you're having problems with Walter Rodney, and so it was a whole movement around that particular time, around the whole question of Black consciousness, and attempting to discredit some of these people who still retain some of these racist ideas. But I was glad you mentioned that, in that, as I said, Errol Thomas, who was a jurist who died a few days ago, was part of that group.
May his soul rest in peace, Earl Thomas. He was alleged of being unfair in grading also the Black students.
Yeah, grading, yeah. Others part of it.
Yeah, so right. So take you back to Ontario when you were studying in Ontario. I recently saw you shared an article with Professor Kenneth Hilborn.
Yeah.
And give us a little bit about that, because the court just recently removed his name from the scholarship that was honored in his name. So give us a little bit about the interaction you had with him, or the confrontation, pretty much, if you want to call it that.
Okay, when I first went to study, he taught me history, one of the history classes. But my contact with him was when I went back to Canada. And by that time, there was the issue of apartheid and so on. And he, on himself, took on this job to discredit the apartheid movement, the movement against what was happening in South Africa. And he sometimes would by himself walk down the street with a placard, making the kind of comments he wanted to make. But what, interestingly enough, as a postgraduate student, I had an office in the history department, an office which I shared with a friend of mine from Nigeria. And next door to us was this famous Kenneth Hilburn. So whenever I'm going into the office, I would see him with a clipping, something dealing with some issue regarding so on. So every time he did that, I would get something to counteract it and place it on my office door. Now, this was a guy who was going to be grading me, but I had confidence that I was doing what I could do, and there's no way he was going to be able to fail me or to do anything. So that went on, and we these things in the newspapers and so on, these things would go on. But he was apparently from a very wealthy family, had a lot of money. And when he died, he left, I'm not sure what the amount is, it might have been in that, with the university in order to provide scholarships, I think. And people at the university, knowing the history of this man, took it up with the university. University eventually applied to the court and were able to get the name of the scholarship redone. I'm not sure about the details of how that was done, but apparently the money stayed with the university, but the nature of the scholarship changed. And it seems that since I left, a lot of things had been happening to him, because I'd seen a few articles where people were criticizing some of the things he had been doing. And it was only a few weeks ago that somebody sent that latest clipping about what eventually happened. So that was, as I said, he was my neighbor in a sense. He had his office next to me. And but he never confronted me about anything, and he graded me fairly. So that was it. But I found it important that there's this guy who, with this kind of reputation, and the matter eventually went to court, and the court sided with the university, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, interesting indeed. Dr. Fraser.
Let me also mention that just in terms of giving a background, the area where I went to is called London, Ontario. Now, when I got the scholarship and I knew I was going to University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, the first thing struck me, the only London I knew was London, Canada, London, England. And when I went there, I realized there was the Thames River. There was a ground which was patterned after lords, and a lot of the people who resided in London, Ontario, actually English people who came there, So the River Thames, I had to pass the River Thames on my way to school, and they played a lot of cricket there. And there was a very English atmosphere by some of the people, which I found very interesting. It's only when I went eventually to England that I was able to see the kind of things that were happening there.
All right. So, Dr. Fraser, in wrapping up, I would break the journalism code if I don't ask you. The passing of Queen Elizabeth II 2 weeks ago, may her soul rest in peace. Do you think that the Caribbean should be, or St. Vincent and the Caribbean to a larger extent, should be mourning for that 4-day period, or what's your take on that in pertaining to the Caribbean island in general?
Well, I don't know this question of having 10 days of mourning and so on. I don't know if that's what is really the need for that. But Queen Elizabeth II is a very interesting person. She herself, when we talk about issues like reparation and so on, we have to remember that she is just a symbolic figure, ceremonial figure. She doesn't have power. Power is with Prime Minister and the Parliament. But what she was able to do over the years was to keep things together at a very challenging times for Britain and also for the Commonwealth, of which Britain was part. Now, I was reading somewhere where somebody said one of the issues now, and they were speaking to how King Charles III would be able to deal with this. One of the issues is her age. She was considered a grandmother. And regardless of what, you have a sort of feeling for your grandmother rather than for everybody. And one of the things about her is that she said very little. So you don't know where she stood on a lot of issues. Mm-hmm. There were problems regarding how she dealt with Diana and also what is happening with Harry and Meghan. But she of herself, you don't know how she felt. Now, right. It is interesting that shortly after she became queen, not shortly after, but she became queen in 52. In 1961, well, Ghana was the first African state to become independent in 1959. In 1957, sorry. In 1961, she went to Ghana and she actually danced with Nkrumah. And, the whole thing about this queen dancing with Nkrumah caught the attention of a lot of people. And apparently, her whole visit did quite a lot, and the Ghanaian people liked it. The only other thing too that where you get some semblance of what she was on to has to do with Nelson Mandela. She didn't. I know there were some difficulties between herself and Margaret Thatcher because Margaret Thatcher was committed to the system in South Africa. And there was some difference between her and the Queen. But shortly after Mandela was released from prison, she invited Mandela to Britain. And she drove in the car with Mandela and actually declared that she was glad that that system died. But apart from that, you didn't get a sense that she never really let her feelings be known about many things. And I think because of that, she was able to maintain things as they were. And a lot of people liked her because she never intruded in things. But now that, but the issue is not really with the Queen itself, the issue is with the monarchy. And it is going to be interesting to see what happens now that she's gone and that grandmother figure is no longer there, how they'll be able to deal with Charles. These are very trying times, even in Britain itself for the monarchy, because there are a number of persons, I think there are probably more people than we realize in England against the monarchy. Than many of them were quiet, but now that she's no longer there, we might see a different kind of approach. But I suspect that in the Commonwealth, a number of countries would, over the next few years, begin to pull away from, well, become republic. They might even remain within the Commonwealth, but the Queen will not be head of their state. And I suspect that would happen. Because we hear even places like New Zealand beginning to talk that way. So she did a lot for Britain, and that she was able to keep it together as a certain figure. She didn't speak out on a lot of issues, and we really didn't where she stood. And I think because of that, a lot of people appreciated her, and her age played a very important part. And she ruled at a very important point, because it was during the time she was queen that you began to have a lot of these African countries becoming independent, and you have Caribbean countries becoming independent. But she was able to survive it all without really coming out and saying a lot about things. So she's a very difficult person that you don't know what she really stood for, apart from one or two examples. And well, the latest thing, the Meghan and Harry thing, was something which we have to look at in terms of our whole approach to them. But it's a period that's gone, and the challenge now would be to the new king. So I think then we'll be able to see what is happening. But the whole question is the royal family. Is it outdated now, even in terms of England? certain terms of the Commonwealth, it's outdated. So I suspect we'd have some big changes.
Right, and that leads to my next question. What would we lose, or what are we gonna gain, or what would be different with Prince Charles? King Charles at the top of the
I don't think we're going to lose or gain anything. I mean, because she was really a symbolic figure. She didn't have any control over what we did. But Charles is a person who is more outspoken. He has spoken out on certain things, environmental issues, and one has to see how he would take on that kind of challenge. Well, we see what had happened in Barbados when he went down there, and he, he accepted the fact that for some countries it's time to go on. The question that is going to confront him is the question of reparations. Is he prepared to make an apology, although it is really the government? He is a ceremonial figure, not head of government. He's head of state. So that is going to confront him as people ask for reparation. What would he state a particular position on that? Would he, on behalf of the British government, apologize? I don't think he could do on his own. It is something which he would have to do in conjunction with the present government and the Prime Minister. So it is still new, and we have to look and see, within the next year what is likely to happen.
Dr. Fraser, I just want to thank you for your time, and it's been an absolute privilege and honor to meet you, listening to you on the radio, to finally meet you virtually. Of course, I hope we'll be able to meet in the flesh. CP is going to have the last word, but just feel free right now to mention your books. You can hold them up, and CP is going to give you a chance to people where they can follow you.
Okay.
The books are available some of them are available on Amazon, and if you can't find it, get in touch with me.
Because the Spiritual Baptist, available on Amazon. The 1935 Riots in St. Vincent, available on Amazon. And From Villain to National Hero, looking at Chatoyer and his struggle for the independence of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that is also available on Amazon. And then, the one, this is no longer in print, but this, as I said, was something that was hurriedly done at the time when Chatoyer was going to be made national hero. And the two for primary schools, I know this one is still being used in schools. Apart from that, I've done a number of things like short biographies of people like Milton Cato. These are papers. These were short biographies done for journals in the US. A biographical sketch of Vincentian political leader Robert Milton Cato. Biographical sketch of George McIntosh. Biographical sketch of Mulzac. Yeah, those are some of the other things. They're short things which are done for a journal in the United States of America. And I've also done articles for dealing with the Garifuna, again for other journals. And so those are some of the works I've done, but they were not books, but other things which I've done. And anybody who wants to go to Amazon, if you just look on there, you bring up Adrian Fraser, you would see a list of the books there. So.
Do you still write for the articles in the local papers?
Yeah. I am a regular columnist with the Searchlight newspaper. I do that every week.
Don't be afraid to say what you do. On this program, you're just free to just sell yourself. Don't sell yourself short at all on this program.
Yeah. No, that's something I do every week, and I've done it for quite a number of years. I
And what's
started
your
out
name?
with-
Yeah, what's the name of your column? The name of your column in the Searchlight for those people who don't know.
it's I think the name point of view, and it's usually, in fact, I have to remember to put the latest one on Facebook, but it's usually reproduced on Facebook every week.
What you can do for me, if you can get in touch with me, get in touch with Morton and send a lot of your information for us so that we can at least put it up on the radio page.
Okay.
Because what we try to do here is always try to make sure that people who come onto this program, as Vincent mentioned, that we extend the, what they are doing to the people. Because sometimes people might know about you. There's certain things it still doesn't really know that you do. So any information that you have and you want to get it out, get in touch with me. Get in touch with Milton, and we're gonna do that for you. Anyhow, it's been a pleasure to have you here on this program. Somebody who I admire from my small writing those stories into the newspapers and all that. So I would like to say once again, thank you very much to take the time out to be here on Vinci Internet Radio. And I hope that you are gonna be with us some other time, because we're definitely gonna bring you back. And in the meantime, I'm giving you the last word. The last word is yours.
No, just to say that I appreciate you inviting me to be on the program. I enjoyed being here, and feel free to call on me at any time, to discuss anything.
We surely will. So once again, Dr. Fraser, thank you a lot to come on to Vinci Internet Radio, and we'll keep in touch, and we'll see you some other time. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so thanks very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, man, great.